All right, everybody, with us this week, we got another Crushie guest, Jeremy Storton from Good Beer Matters and Advanced Cicerone, a beer educator, an award-winning writer and podcaster, a photographer, a man of many talents, also a water polo goalie. So we're learning a lot very early on. But Jeremy, welcome to the podcast, and how's everything going?
Everything's great. I'm stoked to be here. It's kind of nice to be on this side of the podcast escape for a change. So right on. Let's have a nice chat.
Mark DeNote, who also won a Crushie from Florida Beer News, said virtually the same exact thing. Like, wow, this is great. I don't have to do any prep. I just show up and talk. Like, this is what we all do this for, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
A lot of preparation in the podcasting, but Good Beers Matter is a strong brand, and we're so excited to have you on. So we'll hit you with the hard-hitting journalism first, and we'll keep it a little casual towards the end. But, Jeremy, tell us a little bit about yourself and, explain to us the brand of Good Beers Matter.
Yeah. So forgive the correction, but Good Beer Matters, just because it's a there's a double meaning there, and I'll get to that in just a second. I'm Jeremy Storton. I'm an Advanced Cicerone, BJCP judge, IBD certified brewer. I resisted the temptation of beer for a long time. Once upon a time, when I grew up and lived in California, and all the back in my day, we called them microbreweries, and we were happy. But they opened up and they had all these beer with color and flavor, and I just knew that early on, I'd go out with my buddies, college buddies. We'd get done with practice and head out to the local bar, and we'd just grab the local cheap macro lager and play darts and just hang out. And I'd have two beers, and I'm halfway into my third, and I just like, I cannot drink this crap anymore. And at some point along the line, I was like, I need to find something better. And unwittingly, I began the search. I began that journey that kind of is where we are now. And I can draw a direct line from now until then. But at the time, I was like, I don't want to drink crap anymore. Granted, I was a college student. $1 beers made a lot of financial sense at that time, but they really did nothing for the experience. And so I just go out and find, okay, if I'm going to drink something, I'm going to drink at least one good thing. And so that's where I started searching for craft beer, and all these small breweries started opening up, and and they had all the usual suspects back in the 90s, your wheat beers, your ESBs, your IPAs, your all that stuff. And I could never keep it straight. There was the IPA, which had 3 letters, and there was the ESB that had 3 letters. And I could never remember which one was which. There was one I loved, one I hated, and it was a roll of the dice every time I went to go order one. And so ESB was the one that I preferred, and didn't develop a palate for IPAs till later. Then moved to Oregon, and like I say, when in Rome. I started homebrewing with a buddy, and started becoming curious. I started paying more attention that journey that I set myself on in college of like finding something better. Well, I was in the land of better beer, and it was actually watching a wine documentary, Somm, that was just talking about what wine meant to these people who were putting themselves through this rigorous, awful, horrible test for what reason, I don't know, but it just meant so much more to them, and it connected with me on a deep level, and that's when I just like, okay, I'm not going to resist anymore. I need to do something in beer, and then the rest is pretty much history. Good Beer Matters just became a brand because I wanted to learn more. It became a podcast because I realized if I were to call up Garrett Oliver or Gary Fish from Deschutes Brewery and say, pardon me, you don't know me, but can I have an hour of your time? I'd like to pick your brain. They're going to say, hell no. If I said, you don't know me, but I have a podcast I'd like to interview, they'll say, hell yeah. So that became my wedge in the door to learn from all these people who really had something to offer. So next thing you know, here we are.
Yeah, I want to start with Oregon too, right? So when you moved to Oregon, you said when in Rome, right?
Yeah,
and that's when people look at Portland and all the sort of Northwest, the Pac Northwest beer culture, and they say Oregon is some of the best of it. Was that your perception as well? Was it sort of just like culture shock of, wow, I really like beer, there's a bunch of it around me, and now I have to get involved more? Or how, what was your process? What was going through your head at that point?
So I had a ton of serendipity on my side. It was just luck. My parents had moved to a small town just outside of Bend in the early 90s. And so I went up there to visit them and walked into this tiny little brewery in the tiny little town of Bend with a cool ski mountain. And it was this tiny brewery that had been open 5 years. It was called Deschutes Brewery. And it was 93, I think it was. And I walked in, I was like, there's one of these small breweries that, with beer that has color and flavor. Let's go check it out. 10 years later, my wife and I moved to that same small town just outside of Bend. But this was the early 2000s. I mean, craft beer was very, very slow going. It didn't really explode until like the early teens, right? So when we moved to town, there were like three craft breweries in Bend, and maybe there was a dozen in Portland, but there was a legacy already there from the 80s, in particularly in Portland and in Newport with Rogue and with Deschutes and Bend. And so it was just like this was a new sense of normal. Craft beer was normal, and it was slow. It was cool, but it wasn't a thing yet. When it finally became a thing, it's like, when you're surrounded by, world-class art, world-class food, world-class sports, world-class anything, when that's your daily normal, you don't know any better. That's just your normal. And it only took years later going out to other places around the world, around the country, that you realize, oh, what we had right there was not only world-class, but in some respects, the tip of the spear. And there are plenty of hotspots around the world, plenty of hotspots around the U.S. that are the tip of the spear. It just so happened that I lived in one of them, and that's where I really got to know beer, was in one of the places that was really moving and shaking.
Yeah, I mean, Deschutes, I had admittedly not been familiar with it. Sounded familiar, just looked it up, and it makes sense why, right? Small little brew pub that's opened in the late 80s, and all of a sudden it blows up. They opened their brewing production facility in Roanoke, Virginia a couple of years ago, and it's, I mean, that must have been a pivotal moment.
That didn't completely come to fruition.
Right.
You're probably going to get to that anyway, but Deschutes, I've got a lot of love for Deschutes. It was the first brewery that I fell madly in love with. And, 93, I mean, there's personal history there, but Deschutes is one is the main brewery, not the only brewery, but the main brewery that really put American porter into our mindset. They had an incredible brewer who brewed, it was Red Chair. So Red Chair is in Mount Bachelor. They had a Red Chair ski lift. It was iconic and whatever. Well, they named a beer after that. Well, that beer was brewed by a master brewer who had just come from innovating a ton of stuff in the hop world. He was the one who started innovating and creating this new thing called cryo hops. And so that was the first beer that he applied his new technology that he was innovating. He was applying cryo hops to this Red Chair, and they sent it off to the World Beer Awards, and they won best beer in the world for that style 2 years in a row. And it was just like, I mean, Deschutes was already on the map, but now it's firmly in the map. So it was kind of nice to, like I said, I was living in the middle of beer paradise, and that was just every day, no big deal.
So prior to the podcast and your content world, I mean, you come from a background of hospitality. Yeah. Obviously, something that works hand in hand with your background and, of course, the show is your Cicerone certification. So what was the point in your career that, from discovering beer and falling in love with it to then taking it a step further? What was that point that you're like, I should get this certification? And how did that lead to, let's talk about it in the content world?
Yeah, it was, again, it's one of those silly things where I was working at a brewery, nights, kind of make a little bit of money. I think at that point in my time, I was like, I'm going to try and do real estate, like half of everyone else. But since I had two small kids at home, it's like, oh, well, I also need to pay bills. So until this real estate thing comes off, I'm going to work at the brewery. So I did that. And so waiting tables at the brewery. They had an opening for bartender. I had some bartending experience, and I was like, hey, yeah, I'll be a bartender. They said, well, if you're going to be a bartender, you have to get your first level Cicerone. And so this, just for context, this was 2013. And the Cicerone began in like 2009. So it was still fairly new. People were just starting to learn it was really starting to get some momentum, but it was still early. And they said, yo, you're going to have to get your first level Cicerone. And I looked at him and said, what? And so then they explained to me, well, that's what it's basically the sommelier, but for beer. And you have to get this first level. And I had been home brewing for a few years. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll just study up on some stuff and get that. And so I took this test, passed the test, and it was like, oh, well, that was kind of cool that they actually have something like that for beer. Well, fast forward a year, I'm sitting at home watching that wine documentary with my wife, and it's over. We're both like, wow, that was really cool. And my wife says, well, it's too bad they don't have anything like that for beer. I said, well, they do. It's Cicerone. And she kind of like slugged me. It's like, well, why aren't you doing that? And I thought, okay, that was the moment. It was like, okay, I don't know what I need to do in beer, but I need to do something in beer. But because I had a long relationship on and off with hospitality and education and everything like that, I really just kind of thought that, well, this, I thought I'd get into, business and sales and all that sort of stuff. But really what it's really culminated in is just this love for education, this love for kind of like, you guys are a sports podcast as well as beer, just this love for improving your performance really is really what it comes down to. So even if I don't want to say just a server, but if I'm a server, how can I be a better server? What does that mean? That means how can I put more money in the till and pour more money in my pocket and have my guests come back every week and ask for me by name? That's performance. And so I started thinking about that. I started thinking about having more knowledge and more ability to kind of share this flavor profile. And again, it was all aligned with my time in college. Like, this stuff sucks. I need to find something better. How can I help my guests find something better? And that's really what started coalescing and kind of became what I'm doing now.
And how did things, how did things change for you, in your opinion, after that? Right. Like, you mentioned those lessons learned about, like, appreciating the, just appreciating the product for what it was and things of that nature. But, was there a moment that maybe it was with a customer or somebody sitting at the tap room that, you sort of look back at and say, yes, like that's where this certification and this process helped me?
Great question. I think, I didn't have my thumb on it, at the time. I had enough experience in hospitality, in education, where it was, they talk about in education, it's not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. Right. And so it was the same thing of like, how can I get these people to, just like most people, as think a beer is just a beer, just like a burrito is just a burrito. Well, if you've ever had a mind blowing burrito, then it'll never be the same. I think that moment came when I just realized that I was, I wasn't just showing up and taking orders. I realized that these people were looking to me, who had some knowledge, had some authority about, this beer tastes like this. It goes great with this menu item. I started figuring out that there's something here to it. And I wasn't quite sure what it was. What really came down to it is, as I was studying for my certified Cicerone, the second level of Cicerone, I got a hold of Garrett Oliver's book, the Brewmaster's Table. And in the second chapter, I think it was the first page, he starts talking about, beer and food is so much more. And when you seek better, and he quote, I guarantee you a better life. That whole paragraph just really struck a chord and really took everything I had been doing and just kind of sharpened that into a point. And I realized, okay, this isn't about serving a better meal and a better better beer. This was about how can I give people a better experience? How can I, create something that they did not count on? That, to me, the idea of that just became super interesting. So it was that point, that book, that phrase, that paragraph that that really kind of gave me a very solid direction, if that makes sense.
And in terms of like the certification process, how, for someone who knows beer, you brew beer, how much of the gap of education was there from what you knew to each step of that certification?
Another good question. From each level of Cicerone, there's an exponential leap. It's kind of crazy. I tell people that, I learned all this about beer so that you don't have to, because it is a little bit on the ridiculous side, how much you have to know and understand. To go from first level, it was perfect, because it's just, we want to make sure that you know more than your average customer coming into the brewery, and so that you can lead them. Second level, there was a huge leap, because now we're studying geography. Now we're studying not necessarily chemistry, but ingredients and flavor and process and glassware and temperature, and it's just, there's so much more that we needed to know. And then finally, when you get to that third level with Advanced Cicerone, it got into such minutia and such detail, where I remember taking the test, at least the written test. It was online when we took it. I took it toward the end of COVID, and they would just kind of put, you think about the vital stats, the ABVs, IBUs, SRMs, and original gravities, all that stuff. They would just kind of show those numbers and say, what beer style is it? And you had to know. You had to look at those numbers and go, oh, that's clearly an Irish red. Just from when you put those three clues together. And so what by the time you're at Advanced Cicerone, you really have to be kind of a beer detective. You have to take all these clues and be able to work out. If you have an Irish red, you have to be able to go back and say, okay, the brewer did this in their brewing process because I can taste it. I can taste it with that little thing right there. Or the water profile must be X because it's coming out this way, or the hops are manifesting this way. And it just got into such detail that like I said, it's a bit on the ridiculous side, but that just allows me now to take a step back from that ledge. And for people who are interested, most importantly for like beer and food pairings, for example, to be able to deconstruct that, those pieces that work really, really well, to be able to deconstruct that and then put them back together and help people understand how to put it together themselves. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a robust program, and I think you certainly seem to have been better off with it, right? And the question of do you know more than the average beer consumer? I think that answer, based on that answer, is an unequivocal yes. So that's a tip of the hat to you. Well,
I'd say there's information in my brain that most people don't even need to know. So it's just. It was a mountain I had to climb. And people ask, well, would you go after master? And I'd never say no, but it's just, for me, it's just the ROI just doesn't add up. It's like I sacrificed a lot of time, expense, effort, time away from my kids and my wife to get this. I'm glad I did it. I'd do it over again. But at this point, I don't want to go any further. I've gotten what I need. It's time to turn around and share the worthwhile parts with those who are interested.
Yeah, that makes sense. So after that, Good Beer Matters pops up. You mentioned, the reason why you wanted to get into this in the first place is, so you have the in, right? So you can approach these folks and say, hey, I'm, would you give me X amount of your time, right? So what was that moment that sort of, that you said, I can make a brand off of this. I can, maybe I can delve into this podcast world. What sort of set you off there to create what would become Good Beer Matters?
In the beginning, it was, like I said, I wanted to learn more from those who have plenty to teach, but most people don't necessarily have access to. I also knew that I don't know what this brand Good Beer Matters will be. I didn't even know what it meant. I just knew that by the time I figured it out, it'll be nice to have had a couple of years of this podcast behind me already. And so I moved forward with the podcast, and it was one of those, I'll build the plane after I launch off the cliff type of situations. What it's become now, especially, as my vision came into clearer focus, I realized, well, I want to turn this into an educational brand. Education not only from the craft of beer, but the culture of beer as well. I think that is immensely important. We can talk about sports stats all day long, but we can also talk about strangers sitting at a bar cheering for the same team and high-fiving each other, never even knowing their name. There's something to that, right? I think so. What this has become is just kind of sharing this love for beer, this window into different world cultures, this connecting point among different people. That's what I'm trying to share, and that's where I'm trying to share through the podcast. That's what I'm trying to share when I do in-person trainings and stuff like that. I do a lot of beer and food pairing. I say a lot. I'm trying to do a lot. I've done a lot. And so whenever I teach a beer class or beer and food pairing, I want to make sure you learn what you need to learn so that you can turn around and share this with other people, and you can lead. You can instead of being an order taker, you can be a guide at your table, at your bar. You can do that. But I also want to make sure that you have a perspective of like, yeah, I'm holding up this beer. This beer tastes good, but there's a story behind it. There's a culture behind it. There's something that we can take from that and appreciate and just kind of connect with other people on a little bit deeper level just from this beer alone. It sounds silly to say out loud, but it's absolutely 100% true.
And the cultural aspect in your show is one of the reasons that you want to Crushie, but also that I really resonated. It was the fact of your global presence. Especially in this recent year, the conversations that you've had with people from all over the globe. Australia, Asia, different parts of Europe. Yeah. How is that for you, discovering these different types of people in the industry and having those conversations, and how rewarding is it to learn those different cultural experiences while sharing it with your listeners?
Oh my God, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. My whole theory is beer is pretty much an international culture. It's like going to an international airport and you've got every kind of food, you have every kind of people, every kind of language there, and for the most part, people get along or can cohabitate within that airport space for a period of time. Beer's kind of the same way. We can come together, enjoy our beer, high five, nice to meet you, move on. But that's great, but there's more. I wanted to find out how, if you guys were to come to my house and we went out to the local brewery, that's going to be one experience. If I went to where you guys are and you took me to one of your local breweries, it would be very, very similar. But if we really took a close look, it would be a little bit different. And I thought, okay, and that's just within the US. What if we took a look at how people express their beer culture, their going out culture in deeper ways around the world? And maybe, just maybe, if we resonate with the way that they go and have a beer in Southeast Asia, maybe you're like, God, that sounds cool. I'd really like to have that experience. I think about one of the first episodes I did this year was from a woman from Ukraine. And granted, we all know what's happening in Ukraine right now. And it's just, talking about the emerging beer culture, what's happening there, and what's happening with the people, but then discovering that there are actually beer styles that are manifesting in that particular culture because that's their palate, that's their sense of normal. And it's like, well, that's incredible because you get a little taste literally and figuratively, of what life is like somewhere else. And maybe, just maybe, we can have a little bit more appreciation for how people do things somewhere else. And really, ultimately, if I were to rise to a 30,000 foot view of all this stuff, one of the problems I see in the world, and forgive me for sounding like I'm getting political, I don't mean to, but I think fundamentally there's an us versus them problem around the world. It's classic. It's been going on for millions of years. Us versus them causes a big problem. If we can put a beer down at the table and get everyone at that table, then that us versus them starts to disappear. That's what I find magical. That's what I find interesting. And so that's why I've been talking to people around the world about beer, because how can we break down that us versus them barrier?
I like that a lot. And I think, immediately, like we talk about the, if you look at this through the lens of what beers have popped up in other cultures, I mean, maybe it's just because I wasn't aware of this, but in this area, there's been an explosion of rice lagers, like Japanese rice lager this summer. We featured one in our summer 6-pack edition that we did for our site this year. And, I had not even known what a rice lager was. I tried it a couple weeks ago at the Sam Adams tap room in Boston. And next thing you know, there's an East Asian beer style that's sweeping over New England. Right. So I think that's a perfect example of these beer types from different areas of the world, and sort of sharing all in that new style, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and let me pull a little page from improv and say yes. And so we were talking about Deschutes at the top of the show. So I go to Bend every year to judge at the Best of Craft Beer Awards, and then afterwards we take home a bunch of the leftover beer. One of the bottles I brought home from that was a beer from Deschutes, and it was actually one of these Japanese lagers with rice, but they had also added a little bit of Chilean umo honey to it. And I finally just opened that this weekend, and it was amazing. But here you have Oregon, the Pacific Northwest of America, making a Japanese style beer with a Chilean South American ingredient. It's like, not only was the beer good, but conceptually, relationally, culturally, it was fantastic.
And I think that's what's exciting about this craft beer boom in the United States specifically, where, I think one thing we've noticed, especially year after year, people are always going to do Oktoberfest, and more people are like, we have to get on the Oktoberfest train. Yeah. Now I feel you're going to start seeing breweries need to be different, because there's it's a saturated market, but everyone's unique in their own way. Who is going to have the next international type of festival at their brewery that becomes a latching point in that community, where it's like, I need to go to so-and-so brewery for the Rice Lager Festival, or, taking in those different cultures, because it is, like you mentioned, it's a global common denominator amongst everybody is beer, especially good beer. So what are those trends that people are going to start adapting in the United States?
Yeah. And that's one of the other things that I find fascinating by talking to people around the world. And a quick plug on my other podcast with my partner Julia Hers, the Sense of Beer Style, where we talk all about the different beer styles according to the BJCP. But we talk about beer styles, but to challenge that sense of beer style, it's like we could go to Mexico and talk about a Mexican IPA. We could go to France and talk about a French IPA, and a lot of them are trying to brew an American West Coast IPA, American East Coast juicy IPA. But ultimately, it's, if you're in France, if you're in Lyon, France, it's a lot easier for you to get Aramis hops from France than it is to get Cascade from Oregon or Washington. And so maybe let's just use Aramis hops with our IPA instead. Next thing you know, we have a French IPA. If you're using Neo Mexicanos for Mexican IPAs, it's going to be different. Next thing you know, you have a different substyle of IPA. And now we go to this, like you're talking about, we're going to go to this cultural beer fest. And next thing you know, it's like, okay, we've got a West Coast IPA. We've got a New England IPA. We've got a French IPA. We've got, you see where I'm going with that. You have all these different versions of a style, and it can quickly become a cultural celebration but with beer.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I love it. I love what we're discussing here. To come back to the pod, were there any favorite episodes that you had, or maybe a really good conversation or a really good guest that you had been after? What comes to mind there?
Oh man. You're asking me to call out my favorite child, and that's hard to do. I've really, really loved those episodes where the guest has a story to share, something to share with the listener. I've had so many of them with Master Cicerone Rich Higgins talking about how to play detective with your beer style, from my beer mentor Randy Scorby talking about how to really taste your beer. Julie Rhodes talking about beer sales and beer distribution. Those are some of the better ones. A recent episode I did was with Priscilla Colares from Brazil, and just talking about Brazilian beer culture and what the rest of the world ought to know about not only the hops that are growing in Brazil, but the Catarina Sour, that's a new emerging style coming from there, and what we can expect. It's always such an exciting story. It's really fun to talk to some of the people that were my heroes, the Randy Moshers, the Garrett Olivers, the Julia Herzes, and those always satisfy and deliver. But just getting some of these stories from people who can help others do a better job, or getting a story like from Ukraine about, here's what's happening in our beer world up until the war starting, and here's what's happening now, while the war is going on. It's like, I had no idea. For me, it's just it's a really inexpensive short trip to somewhere else. And so just kind of get a little view. I can't pick one episode or even a handful of episodes, but these are some that have just been really particularly meaningful. It's just those kind of things.
And who's on your bucket list? I mean, as you're growing this show, there has to be, whether it's a specific brewery or a specific person in the industry, that it's like, if I can have this conversation and, talk shop for an hour, it makes it all worth it.
I'm super stoked, but almost all the people that were on my bucket list have been on my podcast. So I'm feeling pretty successful. I'd still love to get Jim Cook and Sam Calagione on there. Just as, from like a peak bagging standpoint, where it's just like, okay, yeah, you guys are like heroes in the industry. I'd love to have a conversation with you. With some of the things I'm thinking about for next season, it's not really like the big personalities, but the people who are really doing some really great things, who are names that maybe some people don't even know about, but are still moving the needle forward, like Kate Berneau, for example. I've already had a conversation with her about, I want to have you on the podcast when the time is right. The stuff she's doing for the North American Guild of Beer Writers, and also the stuff that she's, writing for beer. It's like, if people don't know her name, they've definitely come across her writing and have gotten something from her. So that's kind of what I think about. Those are my next people on my bucket list, is just these people who are really doing something awesome.
Well, when you book Jim Cook, you'll have to fly out to Boston. We'll do a collab episode at the tap room or something, and we'll all get our share. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Tell him I'm coming for him, Jim.
We love it. There's a picture downstairs in the Sam Adams tap room in Boston as well. Just saw this last week, where it's a guy sniffing a hop, and a lot of people go, "Wow, who's that creep?" And everybody, the staff takes that as an opportunity to say, "Well, funny you asked, it's Jim Cook sniffing this hop. Let me tell you about Jim Cook." Super interesting guy. We got the chance to learn a little bit about him when we were out in Cincinnati, at their tap room. But that's certainly a white whale for, I'd say, any beer podcast, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But if anyone's listening to this and they're like, "Oh, I know Jim," well, hook us up. I want to have a chat.
Yeah. So, as the program and the brand grows, what is something that you really hope to accomplish by the end of this year, whether it's the storytelling aspect or something in your personal life with craft beer that you want to achieve? And, what do the next 5 years look like for you?
Oh God, that's a great question. So well, besides having a real job and a family, this really has become a, it kind of is a side gig, to put it simply. But my goal really is to have impact. And if there comes a day when it's like, we have all the education we need, we have all the cultural appreciation that we need, your job here is done, thank you for your service, I'd be more than happy to bow out and just go have a beer and just kind of relive the highlight reel. But I still feel a little bit of sense of purpose to help get better education and better service and better appreciation for beer and culture and everything like that to the on-premise, the off-premise. I think one of my theories, one of my beliefs is, the world of beer is constantly improving. We like I said, in places of Oregon and Denver and San Diego and all these other places around the world and the country, we're on the tip of the spear and we're making some incredible world-class beer. We also have consumers who are watching shows like Top Chef, Chef's Table, Chef Shows, Chef this, Chef that. They're learning how good it can be. They're learning how good a meal can be. They're learning how good an experience can be. They're learning to expect an experience, not just a night out. The problem I see is, for a lot of good reasons and a lot of bad excuses, we have the world of restaurants, bars, tap rooms, etc., and even bottle shops and grocery stores where it's like, this is the way we've always been doing it. It's too hard, too expensive, not enough margins to really kick it into gear. So I see that those places are just not delivering on what we're able to deliver and what consumers are starting to demand. That's where I see the ability to kind of share. Not only, I know restaurants and bars don't make excellent margins. If you want to get rich, don't go in the restaurant or bar business. But nonetheless, we're in it. So how can we use what resources we have, what time we have, to make things better? And, kind of like in sports, every day do your best. Then tomorrow, do your best plus one. We can do that in bars, taps, and tap rooms and restaurants as well. And that comes with education. That comes with beer education, food education, service education. That comes from teaching your staff to be, again, sports podcast, to kind of have a little bit of a athletic mojo. You see that athlete walk around, they got a little swagger because they've earned that. They've put in the time, they've put in the work, they've got a little bit of mojo. How can we get bartenders, servers, bottle shop stewards to have a little bit of that swagger as well? And that's through education. That's through connecting. That's through building something better. That's my goal. That's my purpose, is I want to help those people, those professionals, do a better job and deliver on the experience that we consumers are craving.
Love it. It's a great message. Jeremy, we can't thank you enough for hopping on with us. To close out, where can folks find Good Beer Matters? How can they engage with your content, and where can they stay up to date on all the exciting things that you're doing?
Yeah, I appreciate it. So they can go to goodbeermatters.net. And on Instagram, I'm Good Beer Matters. It's easy to find. And again, forgive the shameful plug, but I'm going to plug it anyway. But their sense of beer style, that's also one of the ways that I'm trying to get to help raise the bar, pun intended, on all the stuff. And that's senseofbeerstyle.com. These are all the ways that you can find me and connect.
Perfect. Well, Jeremy, thanks so much. We hope we can all have a conversation with Sam Adams himself, Jim Cook, in the near future. But in the meantime, check out all of your stuff. And thank you again for joining the show.
Yeah, counting on it. Thank you, guys.
All right, everybody. With us this week, we're joined by Mark DeNote. a fellow Crushie winner. We got people in the industry. We got some of the best craft beer podcasts in all of the country and the world, and we're joining forces to talk some shop. But Mark is the editor of the Florida Beer News and host of the BeerWise podcast. He's a certified Cicerone and a 2-time author, and we're excited to have you on the show. So, Mark, welcome to the podcast, and how's everything going?
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Jake. Appreciate you guys having me on. Things are going great, man. It's nice and bright down here. We weathered a hurricane not too long ago, but I'm about an hour north of Tampa in Florida, and things are going well right now.
So we kicked things off before we started recording. So let's talk about who is Mark DeNote and, tell us about your beer story.
Sure. So I was a new dad in 2007, and I started to. My second child was born, and I started exploring craft beer as a teacher. And this guy, one of our co-teachers, was from Maryland, and he's like, "Hey, there's this beer called Dogfish Head Chicory Stout that I really loved, and they had it on tap locally, and we used to go drinking after school on Fridays, and I'd have one or two, and it was really intriguing." And so it started me just starting to explore beers, and then I got into ratebeer.com as a new beer lover, and thought I did what every beer lover does. I printed out the top 50 beers. I went to Nightly Spirits in Orlando, and I said, I want as many of these as I can buy. So I got 2 bottles, and because nothing else was in distro there. So he gave me 2 bottles. I said, well, you don't have 3 Floyds? And he just laughed at me. He's like, no, that's Indiana only. And I was like, what, you don't sell Dark Lord? He's like, no, that's, yeah. And come to find out that Rate Beer wasn't what I expected, but got to know the community, got to expand my beer horizons, moved to Tampa, and the tasting crew that was over in Tampa had such breadth and knowledge. And I mean, I tasted beers I had no business trying as a neophyte beer lover. I brought a 4-month-old Hop Slam to a tasting, and they were drinking Russian River. They were drinking Green Flash, which was only available in California at that time, and so many other great beers. And so I got to kind of explore and realize there was a wider beer world. And then when I look back to Florida, I realized that no one was really doing content about my home state. There were nationals, but there were no locals. And so Peg's Cantina, which would be Cycle Brewing now, they started growling and doing more packaging, and no one was reporting it. And I took it upon myself to send it to all the blogs, and no one picked it up, no one cared. So that was one of the first posts I ever did. That was just over 10 years ago. And I've been rolling with FloridaBeerNews.com ever since, and started the podcast because we had a good conversation. We started a good conversation about beer, and it's just, they happen, they're fun. And then it would be cool to share those conversations, and podcasting was a good way to do that. So the BeerWise podcast kind of started that way as a salute, love letter to the beer industry and craft brewers and everything that they do, and kind of telling the story. Because when I was writing my books, one of the things that I found was that a lot of folks didn't realize that they were making history when they were making history. So a lot of that stuff gets thrown away. A lot of that stuff gets forgotten. And so I'm trying to chronicle as much of that as I can in the meantime. So.
Yeah, I want to talk about Florida too, because, being from the Northeast, we, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, all of these beer, meccas, right, that a lot of people in the national world just associate with good craft beer. Florida generally is not on that list, right? When people think of Florida, they think of the beach, they think of, other stuff, right? They think of, you type in Florida man and you see what kind of crazy stuff comes up, right? But there are plenty of well-known breweries in Florida, right? Like Cigar City, obviously, is one of the more mainstream ones. Jai Alai was something that I grew up drinking before I was 21. So that's, one of the first things I think of when I think of Florida beer. Like Funky Buddha, we're both Bryant grads. We know Corey Adams with Southern Wells, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, how would you, this has been your life, right? So how would you describe this Florida craft beer scene, and what makes it so unique from other states?
So I have to acknowledge that you make me feel ancient, because I was volunteering with Cigar City when they first opened, and I was in my late 20s. So, but yeah, so Florida, you're right. Florida was a beer wasteland. When I wrote my first book, to give you an idea, my first book was published in 2014, and the state had 90 breweries. in the whole state. When I did my first tour, when I got the idea for a book, I started in Fort Myers and I finished in Boca. We went from Fort Myers to Funky Buddha, all down and across the state in one day. That was day one. And day two, we wound up in Cocoa Beach. And we hit all 8 breweries that were down in that part of the state. Now you can't finish a couple counties in that time. And Tampa Bay has 90 breweries. So talk about the 5 counties that call Tampa home have probably over 90. Florida is definitely a matured beer scene. It started from the pioneers. You can't talk about Florida beer without talking about Dunedin Brewery, Tampa Bay Brewing Company, Cigar City, of course. The ones that were doing it before it was cool, the Trailblazers. Everybody forgets about there's a brew pub in Pensacola area called McGuire's that actually Wayne Wombles from Cigar City started. He brewed with the guy who brewed at McGuire's, taught Wayne how to brew and was one of his early mentors up in that area, because Wayne's from Alabama and parts that way, or went and learned to brew in that part of the country. So it's grown a lot. It's matured, and one of the things and talking about Florida, I have to talk about Tampa, because Tampa has matured significantly. Tampa is really the beating heart of Florida craft beer and innovation in Florida, with Green Bench and Cycle and Cigar City and Coppertail and Angry Chair and Magnanimous and Berry House and some of these breweries that are just doing a phenomenal job. But what's really, when I went to Denver for the first time, one of the things I noticed about 10 years ago, that was a mature beer scene because breweries were niching off. You had your Belgian brewery, you had your English brewery, you had all of these different cultural breweries. And now Tampa, specifically Florida generally, is seeing that. We're seeing a brewery that can exist doing only lagers, a brewery that can exist doing mostly sours. And everyone kind of has what they're known for, and then what they do really well. So like Angry Chair, for example, everybody knows them for their stouts. They do really solid lagers. They do their Czech Pils is phenomenal. Their American Light Lager is surprisingly awesome. And so it's one of those matured beer scenes where you don't just come for highlight. You come to see what folks are doing. And we've also matured to a point where there are a lot of closings recently. We closed 5 breweries in a month this year at a certain point, and it's getting bad in terms of doing business with the PPP money running out. And post-pandemic, really, we are where we were a few years ago almost, but there's still a lot of hurting going on in the industry.
And in terms of like the scene as a whole, is there, I mean, you were mentioning a few different areas, but is there a city that you love and you can spend the rest of your life in just based off the beer?
Tampa. I mean, Tampa for sure. Jacksonville is surprisingly, I went there recently and it really surprised me. Even Orlando, I went there last week, and the scene has some amazing breweries, but then some of the new guys are doing awesome stuff too. I'll tell you this, I'm at a point where when I travel, no matter where I go, I want to come home. There was a point where I wanted to just stay away when it came to beer and bring back as much. I still bring back far too much beer, but I want to come home. I want to see the stuff that we're doing in my home state is really exciting. And there was a point where Terrapin was our local brewery. That was the most local beer we could get that was close to solid, or hitting the right notes. That was pre-Cigar City and where Florida really made a name for itself.
And you mentioned the beer that you bring home. I mean, we're very fortunate being in an industry where we get to try some awesome stuff. We take home definitely more than we need. What's the stash looking like back at home? Are you in the dozens, or is it in the hundreds? Is it multiple mini fridges and a kegerator, and the main fridge is there's no food to be had in there, it's just beer?
Oh God, my wife's not listening to this. She, for Christmas last year, we moved into a different house, and so I had a double-sized closet that was filled to the brim with beer. Downsized some of it in the pandemic. Honestly, I started drinking some of those bottles and realizing that they don't age near as long as they. But then I have a whole hall closet that's full to the brim. I bought an entertainment center that became bottle storage, and then I have an outside fridge and a can fridge for going out when you're going outside to drink on the patio. So yes, far too much. And it doesn't matter. It's like, oh, I got it down to a few empty shelves. They somehow magically refill themselves.
It just keeps replenishing, right? It's like, yeah, do I
Yeah.
really need to stop at Treehouse again? No, but you bet your ass I'm going to take a case home.
Yeah. I mean, it's the gnome. We're gonna have the house sprayed for gnomes because they keep refilling it, even though I loudly tell them not to. Yeah.
It's but it's magical, right? It just keeps replenishing. It's but at the same time, a couple $100 leave the bank account. You're like, couldn't have possibly been me. No way. Too funny. But anyway, I mean, so all your knowledge about Florida craft beer that turns into, as you mentioned, two different books. One of them is the Great Florida Craft Beer Guide, and the other is Tampa Bay Beer: A Heady History. Your decision to turn all of your knowledge into these books, was that someone that maybe recommended that to you? Was that just marinating in your own head? Was that a goal of yours ever? And what did you aim to set out by putting those, into book form?
So the books were an interesting experience. I worked real hard in the beginning, thinking that a book was kind of the end all be all. That once it was a book, it was solidified, and it had to be. And then what I didn't realize was that when you write a book, it's immediately outdated. And when you're talking about current history, it's immediately outdated because those breweries have closed, those breweries have moved, things have changed, people change, and so I got a college education from those books. So what I learned was what I just said, but then what goes into writing books. So publishers don't want to know what you know, they want to know what they can sell. And so they're working with different goals. So we kind of have to dovetail our goals and make sure that everything's aligned. And so the first book I wrote was with an academic press. They were an offshoot of the University of Florida, and they were phenomenal to work with. It was a great experience. I had to push back. They edited it. We did a great job. The second book was also a great experience, but they were more of they weren't academic. They were more a professional, publishing. Like, this is how we make money. It's the little books you see when you go to like kitschy roadside stands that do pictures of local paraphernalia and whatnot. It's the kind of memorabilia, nostalgia type stuff. And so they were very much deadline oriented and driven. And it was really an expansion of the Tampa section of my book. And so now I look at it and it's like a frozen moment in time where I could tell everything was. But it's not. So my next experience with books is going to be more evergreen. It's going to be more it's going to know that it's a snapshot. And so it's going to kind of acknowledge that it can't be, because the scene's grown times 4, times 5 really, since I've grown. So I'd have to write 4 more books on top of updating that one. So it was an experience that I would replicate, but I'd go into it a lot smarter.
It's funny you mentioned that. I remember, I think it was 2 summers ago, I was up in Vermont, and same thing, one of those like roadside country stores and something like that, and there was a book for every state about the craft beer.
Yep.
And I looked at the Rhode Island one, and it looked very thin, and it was probably 7 or 8 breweries, and now there's 40 in Rhode Island.
Yep.
And some of them have been acquired, changed ownership, and I'm like, damn, that would have been a cool, not only for myself, but like a gift to give, but it's already so outdated that it's like, oh, if anyone actually goes to any of these breweries, 2 of them aren't even in the location anymore. Yeah. Logos have changed, people have changed, and there's also 20 new breweries that might actually be better than what's present. So it is the book game. It's a cool concept because it's like, I made this, I did this, I got it published, but then in 6 months you're like, wow, it's actually it's a history book, not a present day book.
But the interesting thing with that is that a lot of that stuff was. There is a lot of history in Tampa and in Florida, and there was a gentleman who actually went through and compiled a lot of it, who I spoke with, and he was just doing it for historical societies. So a lot of the historical research, he gave me permission to use and critique and chop up his work, and so a lot of that stands on his back, which was very fortunate. And the other thing was that the publishers, at least, so the one publisher that does those small little books, they know that. And I've offered to update the book, and they're like, "Nah, we're good." They have a contract with Walgreens, And now in every Walgreens in the Tampa area has a copy of my book in it, which is kind of fun. I've gotten more tags, more pictures on Facebook, more responses from them getting it into Walgreens, and it's on like the bottom shelf by the pharmacy or something. But it's all that Tampa history stuff, and it's kind of fun.
So is there any thought, how old are both books? Are they, when was there a gap in between the time you wrote them?
So it was one came out in 2014, one came out in 2015.
Yeah. So was there any thought like right then and there, like, oh, do I have to update this every year? Like anything like that? Like how did that process marinate in your mind as well?
So I thought it was going to be an ongoing, like, hey, I'll update this every so often and we'll just keep it fresh. But yeah, that publishing a book is moving a mountain in some regards. I mean, and it really isn't something that the publisher just wants to take on willy-nilly, because they got to sell through the first run before they decide to do a second run, if they're going to do a second run. So I didn't realize that the history book, the Tampa book, had gone to hardback until somebody showed me. Like, oh, I got it in hardback. It's like, I didn't know it came in hardback. And that some of those fun lessons that they didn't share with me, the publisher didn't share with me until I saw it. And it's like, oh, that's pretty cool.
And I mean, now we're in the digital landscape of podcasting, blogging, videos, you name it. So with the BeerWise podcast, and I guess with Florida beer news as a whole, what's the type of content that you're making? How has it evolved since your inception? And, what are your main goals of when you're making content and having conversations? What do you want to accomplish?
So when the news medium, the Florida beer news, is really, it's about 80 to 90% news, like what's coming out, who's releasing what, who opened, who closed, what's happening. It's really about current events, with obviously sponsorships and advertisements and all that. But the goal there is to try and stay as current as possible on what's happening in Florida beer, with all the breweries. The BeerWise podcast is where I really have an opportunity to deep dive and have a conversation with folks. I try and expand outside Florida. Florida is where I have a fair amount of connections, so that's where I kind of stay as much as I can, because there's a lot going on here too. But I like to, Mariah from Dogfish was on the podcast. Trying to get Jason from Allagash on the podcast. There's a couple. I'm trying to branch out as much as possible, because there's a lot going on in the wider world that Floridians don't know about. But the goal there is really more of a deep dive and a conversation about the greater beer scene and some of the emerging trends. Where do we go after hazies? How are cocktails and how is alcohol evolving? How is the beer scene evolving? What comes next? And then just kind of getting to know the folks a little bit, outside of what you're releasing and what beers you prefer to make, kind of thing.
So with that being said, any episodes that jump out to you as maybe a favorite or a really good conversation that you had? What are some of those standouts for you?
So I had one of my favorites. I got to talk to Joey Redner, who founded Cigar City, and we had a nice conversation about what it was like to sell the brewery, what it was like the day after he sold the brewery, and he really, being this far removed from everything, we had a nice conversation about the whole brewery owning experience, and he's very candid, and doesn't really pull punches with that stuff. That was cool. One of my other favorites is Doug Dozark from Cycle Brewing, who chose to focus most of his brewing efforts on barrel-aged stouts. And he had a real issue with supply and demand, where his stuff was reselling on the black market for a couple $100, and he decided to take on the black market and make enough beer to meet demand. And now he's got boxes of his releases sitting in the brewery. It's like, as soon as you meet demand. So we had like an hour and 20-minute long conversation about that. And I've known Doug since he was at Cigar City, when he first started brewing, and we talked about the evolution of beer and how his beers have evolved, and that one was really one that I kind of hang my hat on. But there are lots of them. There are so many. Everyone, the hard part's remembering to push record, and the hard part's is wrapping it up, because I found that there's a happy medium in time. I love going over an hour, but my car ride is about 45 minutes, and that's about one episode's worth. So I try and satisfy everybody as much as I can. Then my wife listens to him for QA, and she gives me advice on what she thinks. She hates the word collab. She thinks, but I get every once in a while, as a layperson, somebody who doesn't care for beer, she gives me an honest opinion, so I use her as my QA.
So in terms of like the breweries that are in Florida, how many have you had conversations with compared to the number that is present today?
Oh gosh, I have had. I'm on episode I think 25, and so I've spoken to maybe 10, maybe probably 10% of the breweries in Florida, and then of those 25, probably 20 of them are Florida breweries. I had James Blankenfeld, who did the documentary on Tampa Bay beer, John Lascalzo, who's a local chef who does pop-ups that are amazing, all beer-centered recipes, beer-related, beer-infused food, and a couple others that aren't necessarily brewers or owners, but mostly brewers and owners.
So you got a ways. Who are your white whales in the industry, whether it's within Florida and then just in the craft beer world? If it's like, if BeerWise can land X, Y, and Z, I can be happy and, live the rest of my life. But those white whales.
Vinny Chilurzo is one. I've spoken to him for articles I've written, and he's just a really cool, down-to-earth guy. So I'd love to get him. Jason Perkins, when they launched Florida, we had a conversation of getting to know Allagash, and he was supposed to come on the podcast, and then kind of lost touch. And then Dan Carey from New Glarus, I was writing an article for a freelance job, and he's like, yeah, just call me on my cell. Here's my cell number. So it's like, I have Dan Carey's cell phone number in my hand. I'm gonna call him, and he's like, oh hey, I'm just walking through the brewery. We had like a 30-minute conversation, and just very nice Midwesterner, and I said, New Glarus is my favorite breweries, and I'd love to talk with him and his wife Deb about that, but there's just so many cool folks, and that's the thing I love about craft beer is that you never know who the next amazing person is going to be. I had somebody turn me on to one of the guys I was exchanging beers with, Mad Fritz, who I'd never heard of in Napa, and they call it single origin beer. So not only does he the hops are local, but he tells you what well the water came from, and he'll use different water wells for his beer to show you the different flavors and local hops and ingredients and barley. And so he blew my mind in a 45-minute conversation just with his different theories about taste and flavor and terroir, because he's a winemaker and a brewer, and just that became a fascinating conversation. And I never would have had it if somebody just didn't say to me, oh hey, you gotta check this guy out. So you never know who the next white whale is going to be. I never know who the incredibly fun conversation is, and then hopefully in-person podcasts are so much more fun, because then you can enjoy a beer with the folks and see what's actually happening in the local scene too.
Yeah, to that point, I think some of I would hope Will agrees with this, that some of the the most fun that we've had is sitting in Cincinnati with the Sam Adams folks, or in Rhode Island with the 3 or 4 breweries that we've chatted with in a span of 6 months on site, or doing our first live interview in the thick of COVID when the brewery just started to get back open. I would certainly concur. Those are the best times.
Yeah,
but
it really gives you a sense of place too, because beer is kind of, the more I write about beer is kind of fourth dimensional, in that you can take the beer into your home, but to see the beer in its own environment and the spirit of the people that go into it, that really paints another dimension to the picture of the beer.
Yeah, certainly agreed there. As we move to the Crushie talk, congrats, man.
Thanks,
we're sitting among royalty. So
right.
We'll give you the virtual handshake here. So Gold Crushie for BeerWise. What did you end up submitting, and how'd you find out? Were you one of us that I remember Will was watching the live stream. He calls me and goes, "Dude, we got a Crushie." So how did you find out? And
even before that, I was like, I didn't even know the live stream was happening. It was one of those things where if we both knew that the conference was like, this is where it's happening, and like, even if they didn't tell us like, hey, you're going to win something, if they said you should come down, we would have made the accommodations. I saw it pop up on Facebook, and I'm like, oh yeah, we submitted that. I'll take a look. And it was just at the moment where like they were just announcing it and I hear our name and I was like, whoa, I totally forgot about that. So let's hear your story.
Mine's similar to yours, Will, more so than yours, Jake. It was, I got all the emails about the feed. I was like, yeah, there must be plenty of entries. Like, yeah, okay. And then I took a look, and I think I had the time zone off or something. So I think it was Central Time where it was in Tennessee. And so I was like, yeah, I'll tune in a little bit later. And then my phone buzzed. I was sitting at dinner with my family, and my phone buzzed, and I'm like, holy cow! Like, I congrats. It's like, for what? It's like, you won. It's like, well, I won what? Like, it just didn't enter my mind. And then I thought, oh, wow. And then to see I won gold and to see the company I was in with some of the podcasts, I mean, your podcast, Julia Hers. I mean, that to me was just that was, it's not why I do this, but it really was affirming. It really helped to, keep me moving forward. Because, there are days where you're like, man, do I want to do, it's so fun when you're in the moment. But to get the prep and to wrangle the cats to get everything in line is can be a challenge. And so it's like, yeah, this is fun. This is really that helped me just kind of nod my head and smile that day. So
yeah, I mean, it's definitely watching. We had Jim McCune on from the Craft Beer Marketing Awards probably 2 years ago, where like they were just starting to, well, they've had it for a little bit, but ramp it up and stuff. And that's how we discovered this. And it's really interesting to connect with people that, are talking about the industry, because like you mentioned, no one was really covering it in Florida. I still don't believe there's enough people covering it in the United States for the way it's growing. I mean, the craft beer industry is growing just as fast as the internet boom, right? I mean, it's at the point where everyone is drinking beer, everyone is stopping by, and the breweries, even despite a pandemic, are, there might be some closing, but 2 more are coming right in their place. Yeah. So I think the media side's so interesting, and watching people cover it across the country is pretty special.
Yeah, well, and I think everybody has a different take too. I've listened to a fair number of podcasts where I just didn't agree with the take that they had, or I didn't agree with the what angle they were coming from, and I wanted other questions asked. And so podcasting, again, my wife has been immensely helpful, where she's like, just start. Because I'm one of those people where I want everything to be in a row. I want to have, well, this can't happen until this can, and this happens, and this has to happen, and then once all that and the moon and sun align, then it's like, just start. And so once I started, I mean, my first episode is not something that I submitted for awards, but I
joined the club on that one though.
Right, and I think that's part of it though, is until you get to the point where it's like, that was a good podcast, and that's a wonderful high of endorphins when you get that feeling. And learning editing and teaching myself how to edit all that stuff, and everything that needs to line up. And it's an experience I'm glad I went forward with. But then to get the award and then to be on shows like this with you guys, it's really cool. It keeps me going forward with craft beer, and the beer is great, but the folks are just as great.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Got me thinking back to our first episode in April 2020, where we were bored out of our skulls. We did a fake March Madness tournament, basically, and that was, and then 3.5 years later, here we are. So yeah, that first episode, to your point, is not something we would have considered submitting. You're exactly right there. Any breweries that have sort of inspired you along the way? You mentioned Cigar City was a big one. You got to chat with a lot of the folks that were involved in sort of building that up, but were there, from an inspiration perspective, like, anyone sort of that you had admired throughout this process that you haven't mentioned already?
Not particularly. I mean, I've always inspired. The thing about craft breweries is that it really is the American dream in motion, where you got a recipe, you got beer, and you just want to make a living for you and your family, moving everything forward with your dream. And to see the challenges that a lot of these folks have overcome, and to see the learnings that have taken place, are really, really inspiring all around. I enjoy the aspect of supporting the breweries with this. I mean, my following isn't huge. My lists aren't terribly long, but it's something. It helps to tell the story, and the fact that it lives out there on the internet, and they can have somebody that they know 100% is on their side and really has no ulterior motive except to help them. It's that's what really inspires me, and it's the endorphins of telling the story of feeling like a member of the community. That's really where it's at. And they're just seeing what the breweries are doing now. I've become a huge fan and supporter of Magnanimous Brewing in Tampa, Berry House in Tampa, Seven Sun. There's a large number of breweries that are really excelling despite some odds, despite the pandemic, despite other breweries closing down, and that are really continuing to innovate. Cycle, Green Bench, I'll keep mentioning them, Calusa, some breweries that are really doing fun stuff and being a part of that national scene, and just expanding the conversation about what is beer, what can it be. That's really inspiring.
And on a personal note, I mean, it's a very ambiguous question, but in your eyes, what is a perfect brewery? From the inside, the beer, what they have to offer, the vibe, what in your mind is, the Mark DeNote 5 out of 5 on Untapped perfect brewery experience?
The best brewery experience to me is an authentic one, is one where the beer is good, the vibe is, I can sit outside, I can sit wherever I need to, wherever it is, the people aren't pretentious, the customers, it's amazing how the customers kind of help shape the brewery experience too. And everyone is just kind of themselves. If I need explanation, if I need help, it's there. If I ask questions, they get answered or they get deferred to somebody who knows. It's just I mean, obviously, I like a brewery needs to be clean. The beer, and the one thing that's become my pet peeve is single style breweries, where you go and the tap list is all one style. Because I'm a very promiscuous drinker. I want to drink a Keller beer as much as I want to drink an IPA or a Hefeweizen or an Imperial Stout. I want to test the brewer's chops. I want to see what your Kolsch tastes like. I want to see what your West Coast IPA tastes like. I want to see what your anything but a hazy tastes like. And I want to see I'm not a huge hazy fan. I'm selective about who does it, because I think hazies have kind of become what barrel-aged beers were in the 5-10 years ago, where everybody thought they needed to do it. And so not everybody's doing it well, but there's a lot to be said for a brewery that just listens, I'm a pescatarian, so I don't eat meat. They might have an offering or two for vegetarian, pescatarian if they have food. They have a gamut of styles that are all done well and with care. They might have an interesting seasonal or two, and then I'm okay sitting at the bar. This is gonna sound awful. I don't care for live music at a brewery, because I go to talk to people, not shout over a band. I don't love sports at a brewery, especially if it's there. I don't love the sound on. But I mean, there are some people that have nailed it. And a lot of times it's that single bar manager, bartender, brewer, owner who tends bar, who just loves what they do, and it shows. And those are some of the best experiences. They curate the tap list so that you're never overwhelmed by, oh, good, another IPA, or there's 18. I've never seen an 18 brown ale brewery, but I'm sure they might exist somewhere in the world. Casks are cool, but not obligatory. And just that kind of feeling where you feel welcome and there's plenty to drink and plenty of reason to spend time there.
So we're going to ask you another very ambiguous question before you go. What would you say your favorite beer is in the country?
I love that question, because I ask it of my guests too, and everybody kind of squirms. It's such an existential question for a beer lover.
Yeah, now you're on the hot seat now, so that's the price you pay with not having to prep and the questions and stuff. You got to answer that tough question now.
That's fair. My favorite beer is the beer in my glass. Is the easy way to go. But if I had to pick, because it changes honestly. Right now, I'm drinking a ton of Allagash White. Because we don't have it in the area where I live. And so when I travel to Tampa, I have to pick it up and then bring it back. But in all, best beer I've ever had. McKellar made a Calvados aged barley wine back in the day, and they released like a stupid small number of bottles and somebody brought one to a tasting, and it's probably the fact that I only had like an ounce and a half of it, that it's still but I'm a huge barley wine enthusiast. Yeah, that's the one that I kind of remember. Looking around, I've got bottles lined the ceiling of my office, and all of them have kind of a story. So yeah, that one, or maybe Pizza Port, bacon and eggs. That was one of the first beers I had at GABF that kind of blew my mind. No bacon in it, obviously, but just a really robust porter. I guess, I mean, you know how well you get going and you just kind of, oh yeah, and there was that one too. Oh yeah, that was a good, kind of go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Oh man, there's I mean, that's sort of an unfair question because we could go on for days like that. But
yeah.
Mark, we can't thank you enough. This has been really cool talking shop with you. To give our listeners an idea, where can they find you? Anything for BeerWise coming up that you want to plug? How can they stay in touch with the work that you're doing down in Florida?
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate it. Always great talking beer with anyone who wants to. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I am FL Beer News is my website and my social channel there. BeerWise is part of Florida Beer News right now. It will split off in the future. I have beerwise.org that is under construction, where BeerWise will be kind of its own separate entity. I do that in my spare time. And then the BeerWise podcast is always tagged on with the hashtag BeerWise on any social channel where it is. And then I'm on LinkedIn under Mark DeNote in Tampa, Florida. Or
Awesome.
Florida.
Perfect. Mark, well, we appreciate the time. Thanks so much, and congratulations on the Crushie. We're looking forward to following along, and we'll let you know if we're ever in Florida to grab a beer. But
please do.
Yeah, thanks so much, and take it easy.
Too. All right, thanks.